The morning Ivy Mercer's life changed forever started the same way every market day started. With humiliation, she pretended not to notice. She stood behind her rickety wooden table at the edge of Blackthorn Ridge's town square, arranging jars of preserves she'd made in the cramped room above Patterson's stables. Strawberry, blackberry, apple with cinnamon. Each jar wiped clean, each lid tied with whatever scraps of cloth she could find. The presentation didn't matter much. Most people walked past without looking at her twice. The ones who did look usually weren't kind about it. "Lord, Ivy, you still peddling that sugar?" Martha Hendricks called out from 3 stalls down, her voice carrying across the square like she wanted an audience. "Surprised you ain't eaten it all yourself by now." Laughter rippled through the nearby vendors. Ivy kept her eyes on her jars, straightening one that didn't need straightening. "Just trying to make a living, Martha," she said quietly. "Well, try harder. Nobody wants preserves from someone who looks like they'd steal the spoon." More laughter. Ivy's hand stilled on the jar, but she didn't respond. Responding never helped. It only gave them more ammunition, more reasons to remind her that she didn't belong here, didn't belong anywhere, really. Blackthorn Ridge wasn't a town that forgave weakness. Built on the ragged edge of the frontier where the mountains met the prairie, it was a place where survival meant being harder than the land itself. The ranchers were rough. The winters were brutal. The people were suspicious of anything soft, anything different, anything that didn't fit into the narrow categories they understood. Ivy Mercer fit none of those categories. She was heavy-set in a town that valued physical labor and saw her size as laziness. She was unmarried in a community where a woman's worth was measured by her husband and children. She was quiet in a place where loudness meant strength. And worst of all, she was an outsider. She'd arrived in Blackthorn Ridge 2 years ago with nothing but a worn traveling bag and a stubborn gray cat, and the town had never let her forget it. "Ivy, honey, you got any of that peach left?" Old Samuel limped up to her table, one of the few people who treated her like a human being instead of a punchline. "I do." She handed him a jar and he pressed 2 coins into her palm, more than the preserves were worth. "Don't let him get to you," he said quietly. "Martha's just mad her own daughter can't cook worth a damn." Ivy managed a small smile. "Thank you, Samuel." He tipped his hat and shuffled off, leaving Ivy alone again with her jars and her thoughts. The morning sun climbed higher, heating the dusty square. Families moved between stalls. Children darted through the crowds, laughing and shouting. Life continued around her like she was a rock in a river, present but irrelevant. She was about to rearrange her jars for the 3rd time when she heard it. Not a sound exactly, more like the absence of sound. A pocket of stillness in the noise of the market. Ivy looked up. In the center of the square, maybe 20 feet from her stall, stood a small boy. He couldn't have been more than 7 or 8, thin and pale with dark hair that needed cutting. He stood completely motionless, staring at nothing, while the crowd flowed around him like he was invisible. Or like he was something they were deliberately avoiding. "That's the Veil Boy," someone muttered nearby. "Still ain't said a word. Shame what happened to his mama, but that don't excuse raising a child wrong. Heard they might send him away soon, to one of them hospitals for broken children. Be better for everyone. Boy gives me the creeps, just standing there like that." Ivy watched the child. He didn't react to the voices, didn't acknowledge the people passing within inches of him. His eyes were fixed somewhere distant, somewhere nobody else could see. Then 3 older boys noticed him. "Hey!" The tallest one, maybe 12, swaggered over with his friends flanking him. "Hey, dummy, you deaf and dumb both?" The small boy didn't move. "I'm talking to you." The older boy shoved his shoulder. The small boy stumbled but didn't fall, didn't speak, didn't defend himself. "Leave him alone, Jacob," a woman called half-heartedly from a nearby stall, but she didn't move to stop it. "Why? He don't care. He don't care about nothing." Jacob circled the smaller boy like a predator. "My pa says your pa should have sent you away years ago. Says you're probably possessed or something. That why you don't talk. Devil got your tongue?" The small boy's hands clenched into fists at his sides, but he remained silent. "Bet I could make you talk." Jacob reached out and flicked the boy's ear hard. Something in Ivy's chest tightened. She'd seen this before. Different town, different victim, same cruelty. She'd been on the receiving end often enough to recognize it, and she'd learned over the years that most people would rather watch than intervene. Safer that way. easier. But something about the way that small boy stood there, absorbing the abuse without fighting back, without running, without even crying, made her forget about being safe. Ivy stepped out from behind her table. The movement felt strange. She wasn't used to drawing attention to herself, wasn't used to inserting herself into situations that didn't concern her. But her feet kept moving, carrying her across the dusty square toward the cluster of boys. "That's enough," she said. Her voice came out quieter than she'd intended, but Jacob heard her. He turned, sizing her up with the casual cruelty of a child who'd learned to spot weakness. "This ain't your business, lady." "I'm making it my business." Ivy stepped between Jacob and the smaller boy. "Go find someone else to bother." Jacob's friends snickered. "Or what? You gonna sit on us?" The joke hit its mark. Ivy felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she held her ground. "Or I'll have a conversation with your father about what kind of man he's raising. My father don't care what you think." But Jacob's bravado wavered slightly. "You're nobody." "Maybe, but I'm somebody standing between you and this child, and you're going to have to decide if that's a problem worth solving." For a long moment, Jacob stared at her. Ivy could feel the eyes of the entire market watching this confrontation, could feel the judgment, the amusement, the expectation that she would back down, because that's what people like her did. Instead, she stood there and met Jacob's glare without flinching. Finally, the boy spat in the dirt near her feet. "Whatever. Kid's too stupid to know he was just playing anyway." He and his friends slouched off, throwing insults over their shoulders that Ivy pretended not to hear. The crowd's attention drifted away, moving on to the next distraction. Within seconds, it was like nothing had happened at all. Ivy turned to look at the small boy. He was staring at her now, really staring, with eyes that were far too old for his young face. Brown eyes that had seen something terrible and never quite recovered. Most people, Ivy knew, would try to fix this moment with words. They'd ask if he was okay, demand to know why he didn't defend himself, insist that he speak, that he prove he was normal, that he fit into their comfortable categories of understanding. Ivy did none of those things. She simply knelt down in the dirt beside him, bringing herself to his eye level, and spoke quietly enough that only he could hear. "You don't have to say anything. I just wanted you to know that what those boys did wasn't right, and it wasn't your fault." The boy's eyes widened slightly. "Sometimes," Ivy continued, "the world is mean for no good reason, and sometimes people hurt us because they don't understand us, and that makes them scared. But you're not broken. You hear me? Whatever they say, whatever they think, you're not broken." The boy's lower lip trembled. Ivy reached into her pocket and pulled out a piece of hard candy she'd been saving. She held it out to him without expectation. "This is for you. You don't have to take it if you don't want to." For several long seconds, the boy just stared at the candy. Then, slowly, he reached out and took it from her palm. His fingers were thin and cold. "You're going to be all right," Ivy said softly. Then she stood up, brushed the dust from her skirt, and turned to walk back to her stall. She made it exactly 3 steps before a deep voice stopped her. "Wait." Ivy turned. A man stood at the edge of the square, tall and weathered in a way that spoke of hard labor and harder years. He wore work clothes covered in dust, and his face was all sharp angles and sun damage. His hair was dark, streaked with gray at the temples, and his eyes, the same brown as the boy's, held a mixture of wariness and something that might have been hope. He walked toward her with long strides, and Ivy's heart did something complicated in her chest. Not attraction, exactly, more like recognition. This was a man carrying weight that nobody else could see, and she understood that burden intimately. "That's my son," the man said, stopping a few feet away. His voice was rough, like he didn't use it much. "Silas." "He's a good boy," Ivy replied automatically, then winced internally. What a stupid thing to say. She didn't know anything about this child. But the man's expression softened fractionally. "Yeah, he is." They stood there in uncomfortable silence. The boy, Silas, had moved to stand beside his father, still clutching the piece of candy. "I'm Gideon Vale." The man shifted his weight. "You're Ivy Mercer, the one who sells preserves." "That's me." She waited for the inevitable comment about her appearance or her prices or her general inadequacy. It didn't come. Instead, Gideon Vale looked at his son, then back at Ivy, and said something she never expected to hear. "How'd you do that?" "Do what?" Get him to take something from you. Silas he don't interact much with anybody. Hasn't for 3 years. Ivy glanced at the boy, who was now examining the candy like it held secrets. I didn't do anything special, just talk to him like he was a person. Most people don't even try anymore. Gideon's jaw tightened. They see a kid who don't talk, and they decide he can't understand either. Decide he's damaged. Some want to send him away to one of them institutions. The pain in his voice was raw enough to make Ivy look away. He understands fine, she said quietly. I could see it in his eyes. Yeah. Gideon cleared his throat. Yeah, he does. Another silence stretched between them. Ivy started to make her excuses, to retreat back to her stall and her jars and her familiar loneliness, but Gideon spoke again before she could. Miss Mercer, I got a question that might sound strange. All right. You got work? Regular work, I mean. Something that pays steady. Ivy blinked. No. Just the preserves. And some mending when I can get it. You good with children? I don't have much experience, but That ain't what I asked. Gideon's eyes bored into hers. Are you good with them? Patient? Kind? Ivy thought about all the children in all the towns she'd passed through, the ones who'd thrown rocks at her, or laughed at her, or ignored her completely. And she thought about the few who hadn't, the quiet ones, the scared ones, the ones who understood what it meant to be different. I try to be, she said honestly. Gideon nodded slowly, like she'd confirmed something he'd been wondering about. Then he did something that would change the trajectory of 3 lives forever. Come to my ranch, he said. Help my son. I'll pay what I can. Ivy stared at him. You want to hire me? Silas needs someone. Someone who sees him the way you just did. Someone who don't treat him like he's broken or try to force him to be something he ain't. Gideon's voice cracked slightly. I've been failing him for 3 years. Maybe you won't. Mr. Vale, I'm not a doctor. I'm not trained in... Don't want a doctor. Had plenty of those. They poke him and ask him questions and write things down in notebooks, and none of it helps. He glanced at his son, and the love in that look was almost painful to witness. I just need someone who'll be patient with him, who'll treat him decent. You did more for him in 5 minutes than anyone's done in 3 years. Ivy's mind raced. This was insane. She didn't know anything about helping traumatized children. She didn't know anything about ranching or living in the wilderness or any of this. But she also didn't have anywhere else to go. Her rent was 2 weeks overdue. Patterson had already warned her that if she couldn't pay by month's end, she'd be sleeping in the street. The preserve business barely kept her fed, let alone housed. And winter was coming, the brutal frontier winter that killed people who didn't have solid shelter. Where's your ranch? She heard herself ask. 20 miles north, up in the valley. It's isolated, but the house is sound. You'd have your own room, 3 meals a day, and whatever wages I can spare after the hands are paid. What about... Ivy hesitated. What about his mother? Gideon's face went carefully blank. She's gone. 3 years now. Same winter Silas stopped talking. Oh. Ivy looked at the boy again. Silas was watching her with those 2 old eyes, and she saw it now, the grief he carried, the weight of loss that had stolen his voice. I got a cat, she said, which was possibly the stupidest thing to say in this moment, but it was all she could think of. Cat's fine. Mice are a problem anyway. And I don't know if I can help. I'm not making promises about fixing anything or don't want promises. Just want someone who'll try. Ivy took a breath. This was either the best decision she'd ever make or the worst, and she had absolutely no way of knowing which. All right, she said. I'll come. Something flickered in Gideon Vale's eyes, relief so profound it was almost grief. We're heading back now. You need time to pack? I don't have much to pack. Then come on. 20 minutes later, Ivy sat in the back of Gideon's wagon with her traveling bag, her cat carrier, and the 6 remaining jars of preserves she'd never sold. Silas sat beside his father on the driver's bench, silent as always, but he turned around twice to look at her. As they rolled out of Blackthorn Ridge, Ivy watched the town shrink behind them. She saw Martha Hendricks staring from her stall, mouth open in shock, saw other vendors pointing and whispering, And she saw, standing outside the largest building on Main Street, a tall woman in an expensive dress watching the wagon with eyes like flint. Miriam Crowley, wife of the territory's richest rancher, the woman who controlled half the town's commerce and all of its social hierarchy. The woman who would, in 3 months' time, declare war on Ivy Mercer. But Ivy didn't know that yet. All she knew was that she was leaving behind everything familiar and heading into the wilderness with a silent boy and his desperate father. The road stretched north into the mountains, rutted and rough. The wagon jolted over stones and through shallow streams. Gideon didn't speak, and Silas didn't either, and Ivy found herself wondering what the hell she'd just agreed to. "How long has he been silent?" she asked finally, breaking the uncomfortable quiet. 3 years, 2 months, 5 days. Gideon's voice was flat. He spoke at his mother's funeral, said Mama's sleeping, then nothing since. What did the doctor say? That he's traumatized, that he might never speak again, that we should consider other arrangements. The way Gideon said those last 2 words made it clear what kind of arrangements they'd meant. You didn't agree. He's my son. I don't give up on my son. Ivy heard the edge in his voice, the defensive anger of a man who'd been judged and found wanting by people who didn't understand. I wouldn't either, she said quietly. Gideon glanced back at her surprised. Then he turned forward again, and they rode in silence for another mile. The terrain changed as they climbed into the valley. Pine trees replaced scrub brush. The air grew cooler and cleaner. Mountains rose on either side, their peaks still holding patches of last winter's snow. It was beautiful in a harsh, unforgiving way. We're almost there, Gideon said as they crested a rise. And there it was. The Vale Ranch spread across a natural valley, like something out of a painting, except paintings didn't show you the peeling paint or the sagging fence line or the general air of neglect that hung over everything. The house was a 2-story structure that had probably been impressive once. Now it just looked tired. Several outbuildings dotted the property, a barn, a stable, what might have been a bunkhouse. Cattle grazed in distant pastures. The whole place had the feeling of something that was barely holding itself together through sheer stubbornness. It ain't much, Gideon said, and Ivy heard shame in his voice. It's more than I had this morning, she replied. He pulled the wagon up to the house and helped her down. Up close she could see more details, the cracked windows, the warped boards on the porch, the general air of a place where nobody had the energy to care anymore. I'll show you your room, Gideon said. Then I got work to finish before dark. He led her inside, and Ivy's first impression was of darkness. Heavy curtains blocked most of the light. Dust covered every surface. The house smelled like nobody had opened a window in months. Your room's upstairs, second door on the left. Ivy climbed the narrow staircase, her bag heavy in her hand. The second door opened onto a small bedroom with a narrow bed, a dresser, and a window that overlooked the valley. The room was clean but bare. No decorations, no warmth, nothing personal. It was perfect. She set her bag down and released her cat, who immediately began investigating every corner with the suspicious intensity of a creature who'd been trapped in a carrier too long. Downstairs she heard Gideon's heavy footsteps, then the sound of the front door closing. Ivy sat on the bed and looked around her new room, her new life, and felt the weight of what she'd just done settle over her shoulders. She'd agreed to help a traumatized child she didn't understand in an isolated ranch for a man who was clearly drowning in his own grief, with no training and no plan and no idea if any of this would work. What the hell had she been thinking? The answer came to her as she stared at the dust motes floating in the late afternoon light. She'd been thinking that maybe, for once in her miserable life, she could matter to someone, could be useful, could be something other than the fat woman everyone mocked at the market, even if it was only to a silent boy and his broken father in the middle of nowhere. Ivy stood up, straightened her shoulders, and went to find something to clean with. If she was going to fail at this, at least she'd fail in a house that didn't smell like sadness. Attempt. By the time Gideon came back for supper, the kitchen looked different. Not transformed. Ivy wasn't a miracle worker. But the dishes had been washed, the table scrubbed, the floor swept. She'd found beans and bacon in the pantry and made something that resembled food. Gideon stopped in the doorway, staring at the clean kitchen like it was something from another world. You didn't have to do all this, he said. I needed something to do. And I don't eat food off dirty dishes. He almost smiled. Almost. Where's Silas? Ivy asked. Upstairs, in his room. That's where he spends most of his time. Should I call him for supper? You can try. Ivy climbed the stairs and knocked gently on the third door. The one Gideon had quietly indicated was his son's. No answer. Silas, supper's ready. You're welcome to come down if you'd like. Silence. Ivy waited a moment, then turned to leave. As she reached the stairs, she heard the softest sound, a door creaking open just slightly. She didn't turn around, didn't acknowledge it, just went back downstairs and set 3 plates on the table. 5 minutes later, Silas appeared in the kitchen doorway. He didn't come to the table, just stood there, watching her with those careful eyes. There's a plate for you whenever you're ready, Ivy said, not looking directly at him. No pressure. The boy edged closer, stopped, edged closer again. Gideon watched this unfold with an expression Ivy couldn't quite read. Wonder, maybe, or fear, or both. Finally, Silas slid into the chair farthest from both of them and stared at his plate. They ate in silence. Ivy pretended not to notice the way the boy picked at his food with fingers instead of a fork. Pretended not to see Gideon watching his son with naked hope in his eyes. When Silas finished, he slipped away from the table without a sound and disappeared upstairs. That's the first time he's eaten at the table in 2 months, Gideon said quietly. Ivy looked at him. What does he usually do? Takes food to his room, or doesn't eat at all. She didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing. They cleaned up together in awkward silence. Then Gideon excused himself to finish the evening chores, and Ivy was left alone in the strange, dark house with its heavy grief and complicated history. She found herself drawn to the window, watching the sun set over the mountains. The light turned everything gold and orange and red, painting the valley in colors that hurt to look at because they were so beautiful. She didn't hear Gideon come back inside, didn't realize he was standing in the doorway until he spoke. My wife used to stand there every evening, said the sunset was the best part of the day. Ivy turned, apology already forming, but Gideon shook his head. Don't stop on my account. She was right about the sunsets. He left her there, and Ivy turned back to the window, wondering about the woman who'd stood in this exact spot, watching this exact view, before grief and fever had stolen her away, wondering if she'd ever be able to fill even a fraction of that emptiness. Upstairs, in his room, Silas sat on his bed holding the piece of candy Ivy had given him. He hadn't eaten it yet, wasn't sure if he would, but he kept it anyway, tucked safe in his pocket, the first gift anyone had given him in 3 years that didn't come with expectations or demands or pity. Just a piece of candy from a woman who'd knelt in the dirt beside him and said he wasn't broken. He pulled out his sketchbook, the one nobody knew about except his father, and began to draw. He drew a woman with a kind face standing between him and the boys who'd been cruel. Drew her kneeling beside him. Drew her at the table, setting out plates like it was the most natural thing in the world. At the bottom of the page, in the secret language he'd developed over 3 years of silence, he wrote 2 words that nobody would read for months. She stayed. The first week passed like a strange dream where Ivy kept expecting to wake up back in her cramped room above Patterson's stables. She didn't. Instead, she woke each morning to silence so complete it felt like the world had stopped breathing. The ranch sat in a pocket of the valley where sound seemed to die before it could travel far. No street noise, no vendors shouting, no Martha Hendricks making jokes about her weight. Just wind through the pines and the distant lowing of cattle and the creak of old wood settling. Ivy would lie in bed those first mornings, staring at the ceiling, wondering what the hell she was supposed to do. She had no training for this, no experience with traumatized children or grieving fathers or ranches that felt more like tombs than homes. So she did the only thing she knew how to do. She started filling the silence with ordinary life. The kitchen became her first battlefield. Years of neglect had turned it into something barely functional. Crusty pans, moldy corners, a stove that hadn't been properly cleaned since Gideon's wife died. Ivy attacked it with the same quiet determination she'd applied to surviving in Blackthorn Ridge. She scrubbed until her hands cracked, organized the pantry, discovered a root cellar she hadn't known existed, filled with withered vegetables and potential. Gideon noticed, but he didn't comment. He'd leave before dawn for work that kept him occupied until after dark. Ranch work, he said. Always more ranch work. Ivy suspected he was also avoiding her, avoiding the house, avoiding anything that reminded him his life had changed. Fine. She understood avoidance intimately. Silas was harder to read. The boy moved through the house like a ghost, appearing and disappearing without warning. Sometimes Ivy would turn around and find him standing in a doorway, watching her with those careful brown eyes. Other times she wouldn't see him for hours, and she'd start to worry before reminding herself that his father had managed to keep him alive for 3 years without her interference. She didn't push, didn't demand interaction, didn't try to force him into conversations he couldn't have. Instead, she just lived her life out loud. "I'm making bread," she'd say to the empty kitchen, knowing Silas was probably somewhere within earshot. "Your father mentioned the hands like fresh bread with their supper, so I figured I'd try. Haven't made bread in years. Hopefully I remember how." She'd knead the dough and narrate her process like she was teaching an invisible student. The trick is not to overwork it. You want it smooth but not tough. My mother taught me that. She taught me a lot of things, actually, before she decided I was too much trouble to keep around. Ivy paused, surprised she'd said that out loud. She didn't talk about her mother. Didn't talk about the family that had made it clear she was an embarrassment they couldn't wait to be rid of. But something about the empty kitchen and the listening silence made her continue. She wasn't cruel about it, just practical. Said I'd have better prospects in a city where people didn't know our family. That turned out to be a lie, but I suppose she meant well. The dough came together under her hands. She set it aside to rise and wiped flour from her apron. Anyway, bread takes time, like most good things, I guess. She didn't see Silas slip away from his listening post near the stairs, but she felt the shift in the air that meant she was alone again. The bread turned out decent. Not great, but edible. Gideon ate 3 slices with his supper and actually made eye contact when he thanked her. Progress. On the 4th day, Ivy discovered the garden, or what used to be a garden. Now it was mostly weeds and dead plants, a tangle of neglect behind the house where someone had once grown vegetables. Ivy stood at the edge of it, hands on her hips, and felt something spark in her chest. She could fix this. Maybe she couldn't fix a traumatized boy or a grieving widower or a ranch that was slowly falling apart. But she could fix a garden. She started that afternoon pulling weeds with her bare hands because she couldn't find gloves that fit. The work was hard and her back screamed in protest. But there was something satisfying about the simple physicality of it. Pull the weeds, clear the soil, make space for something new to grow. She didn't notice she had an audience until she sat back on her heels to wipe sweat from her forehead and found Silas standing at the garden's edge. He held something in his hands, a wooden box, old and battered. "Hey there," Ivy said, keeping her voice casual. "Come to supervise?" Silas didn't respond, but he also didn't leave. He watched her for a long moment, then carefully set the box down near the garden gate and retreated to the porch. Ivy waited until he was settled on the porch steps before she walked over to investigate the box. Inside were seeds. Dozens of packets of seeds, organized with a care that spoke of someone who'd loved this garden once. Tomatoes, beans, carrots, lettuce. Some of the packets were old enough that the seeds might not be viable anymore, but others looked recent. Ivy looked up at the porch. Silas was watching her, his expression unreadable. "Did your mother plant these?" she asked gently. The boy's jaw tightened, but he nodded once. "Then we should use them, shouldn't we? Seems a shame to let them go to waste." Another small nod. "You want to help?" Silas considered this for so long, Ivy thought he wouldn't answer. Then he stood up, walked down the porch steps, and came to stand beside her at the garden's edge. He didn't touch the soil, didn't kneel down to plant anything. But he stayed there, watching, while Ivy worked her way through clearing one small bed. "Your mother must have been a good gardener," Ivy said after a while. "This is a nice spot. Good sun, close to the house, smart planning." Silas's fingers twitched at his sides. Ivy kept talking, kept working, kept pretending this was completely normal, a silent boy standing sentinel while a stranger dug in his dead mother's garden. When the dinner bell rang from inside the house, Gideon had installed it so she could call him in from the fields. Silas disappeared without a sound. But the next morning, when Ivy came out to continue working, she found a trowel and a pair of smaller gloves laid carefully beside the garden gate. Her throat got tight. She picked up the gloves, child-sized, worn but clean, and understood what Silas couldn't say out loud. He wasn't ready to help, but he wanted her to keep going, so she did. The days developed a rhythm. Ivy would wake early, make breakfast, and leave a plate warming on the stove for Gideon. He'd eat quickly and disappear to whatever work kept him busy. Silas would eventually drift downstairs, eat in silence, and then vanish to his room or to whatever secret places he occupied during the day. And Ivy would work. She cleaned rooms that hadn't been touched in years, repaired curtains, fixed a broken chair, taught herself to use the ancient sewing machine she'd found in a closet, and started mending clothes that had been waiting for repair since before she arrived. She also started cooking real meals, not fancy. She wasn't a trained cook, but she could make stew and roast chicken and biscuits that didn't taste like rocks. The ranch hands, 3 weathered men who lived in the bunkhouse and rarely spoke to her, started showing up for supper looking almost grateful. "Ma'am, this is mighty fine," one of them said after his second helping of beef stew. "Ain't had cooking like this since, well, in a while. Thank you, Amos." She'd learned their names by asking Gideon. Amos, Dutch, and Frank. "Good workers," Gideon said. "Loyal. They'd stayed even when he couldn't always pay them on time." "Boss is lucky to have you here," Amos continued, then seemed to realize what he'd said and clamped his mouth shut. But Ivy caught the way Gideon's shoulders had tensed at the comment, the way his fork paused halfway to his mouth. After the hands left, Gideon started clearing dishes without being asked. They worked in silence, which was fine. Silence didn't bother Ivy anymore. "You don't have to do all this," Gideon said finally, scrubbing a pot with more force than necessary. "The cooking and the cleaning and all of it. I hired you to help Silas, not to run my house." "I need to stay busy," Ivy said honestly, "and Silas isn't ready for me to help him directly yet. So I'm doing what I can do." "He's watching you." "I know." "Following you around the house when you're not looking?" Ivy paused mid-wipe on a plate. "I didn't know that. Found him in the hallway outside your room yesterday morning, just standing there. Think he was waiting to see what you'd do when you woke up." Gideon set the pot aside and leaned against the counter, looking exhausted. He hasn't shown that much interest in anything since his mother died. "Maybe he's just curious. I'm new, different." "Maybe." Gideon studied her with an expression she couldn't decode. "Or maybe you're doing something right." The word sat between them, fragile and uncertain. "I'm not doing anything," Ivy said quietly. "Just existing near him, that's all." Sometimes that's enough. She didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing. They finished the dishes in comfortable silence, and when Gideon finally headed upstairs to bed, Ivy found herself back at the window, watching the sunset paint the valley in impossible colors. She was still there when she heard the soft footsteps on the stairs. Silas appeared in her peripheral vision, moving like he was afraid she'd disappear if he made too much noise. He didn't come close, just stood near the doorway, watching her watch the sunset. "Pretty, isn't it?" Ivy said without turning around. "Your father said your mother loved the sunsets too." Silas moved a fraction closer. "I never had views like this growing up. Lived in cities mostly. Lots of buildings, not much sky." She traced a finger along the window frame. "This is better. Quieter." The boy edged closer still, until he was standing almost beside her. Close enough that Ivy could see his reflection in the glass, small and thin, and carrying more weight than any child should have to bear. They stood there together, not speaking, watching the light fade from gold to orange to purple to darkness. When Silas finally slipped away, Ivy felt the absence like a physical thing. But the next evening, he came back. And the evening after that, until watching the sunset together became part of their unspoken routine, something neither of them acknowledged, but both of them needed. 3 weeks into her stay at the ranch, Ivy made a discovery that changed everything. She'd been looking for spare blankets in the upstairs closet when she'd accidentally knocked over a stack of books. Cursing under her breath, she'd knelt to gather them up and noticed that the closet went back farther than she'd realized. Way back in the darkness, almost hidden, was a door. Ivy's curiosity got the better of her judgment. She pulled the books aside, opened the door, and found herself staring at a narrow staircase leading up to the attic. She shouldn't have gone up there. She knew that. This wasn't her house, wasn't her business, wasn't her place to explore. But something drew her forward anyway. Maybe the same reckless impulse that had made her stand up to Jacob in the market square. The attic was smaller than she'd expected, cramped and dusty with slanted ceilings and one small window at the far end. Boxes and trunks lined the walls. Old furniture sat covered in sheets like sleeping ghosts. And on every available wall surface, covering the space from floor to ceiling, were drawings. Hundreds of them. Maybe thousands. Ivy stood frozen, her heart hammering in her chest. The drawings were all in pencil, some faint and some dark, some detailed and some barely sketched. They showed everything: the ranch, the mountains, the cattle, the hands working in the fields. There were drawings of a woman who must have been Silas's mother, beautiful and smiling and alive. Drawings of Gideon, younger and less burdened. And then, about a third of the way across one wall, the drawings changed. They became darker, frantic. A woman in bed, too still. A boy standing in a doorway. A man with his face in his hands. The same scenes repeated over and over with slight variations, like Silas had been trying to draw his way out of the memory but couldn't quite escape it. Ivy moved closer, her breath catching. Near the bottom of one section, barely visible, were words. Small words written in cramped handwriting, tucked into the corners of drawings like secrets. She knelt down and read them. Mama sleeping, Papa crying, nobody talks, nobody sees me. I'm here, I'm still here. Why doesn't anybody see me? Her vision blurred. Silas hadn't stopped communicating. He'd been screaming for help the entire time, and nobody had known how to listen. Ivy spent the next hour examining every drawing, reading every hidden message. She learned more about Silas in that attic than she'd learned in 3 weeks of careful observation. His grief, his confusion, his desperate attempts to process trauma that no child should have to face. She also learned that he'd been drawing recently. Very recently. The newest drawings showed her drawings. Ivy at the stove, Ivy in the garden, Ivy standing at the window watching sunsets, and in the margins, in that same cramped handwriting, new words. She doesn't leave, she doesn't make me talk, she stays. Ivy sat back on her heels, overwhelmed. She stayed there until she heard Gideon's voice calling from downstairs. Miss Mercer, you up there? She scrambled to her feet, guilty and flustered. Yes, I'm sorry. I found the attic and Gideon appeared at the top of the stairs, breathing hard from the climb. He took in the drawings, her face, and seemed to understand immediately what had happened. You found his work, he said quietly. I'm sorry, I shouldn't have come up here without permission. No, it's all right. Gideon moved into the attic, his movements careful like he was navigating a minefield. I should have told you about this, just didn't know how to explain it. How long has he been drawing? Since he stopped talking. Started with just a few sketches, then it became this. Gideon gestured at the walls. I come up here sometimes, try to understand what he's telling me, but I'm not good with this kind of thing. Never was. Ivy pointed at one section of drawings. He writes too. Did you know that? Gideon's face went pale. What? She showed him the hidden words, watching his expression crumble as he read his son's desperate attempts to communicate. 3 years, Gideon whispered. 3 years he's been doing this, and I never looked close enough. You didn't know, Ivy said gently. How could you know? I'm his father. I should have known. He turned away, but not before Ivy saw the anguish in his eyes. She wanted to comfort him, to say something that would ease the guilt clearly eating him alive. But what could she say? That it was okay? It wasn't okay. A boy had been crying for help and nobody had heard him. What do we do now? Gideon asked finally, his voice rough. We learn his language, Ivy said. We pay attention. We listen the way he needs to be heard. Gideon looked at her, and for the first time since she'd arrived, she saw something like hope in his face. Can you do that? Can you help him? I don't know, Ivy said honestly. But I'm going to try like hell. That night, Ivy couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about those drawings, those desperate words hidden in corners where nobody had looked. Kept thinking about a boy trying to communicate in the only way he knew how, while adults around him kept demanding he use words he no longer had access to. Finally, around midnight, she gave up on sleep and went downstairs to make tea. She found Gideon already there, sitting at the kitchen table in the dark. Can't sleep either? She asked. Not much these days. He watched her move around the kitchen with an expression she couldn't read. You settling in all right? I know this place ain't much. It's fine. Better than where I was. Market Square wasn't treating you well? Ivy laughed without humor. That's a polite way to put it. No, Blackthorn Ridge wasn't kind to me. People there have very specific ideas about what a woman should look like, how she should act, what she's worth. I didn't fit any of those ideas. Their loss, Gideon said quietly. Ivy turned to stare at him, surprised. He met her gaze steadily. I mean it. You've done more for this ranch, for my son, in 3 weeks than most people could do in 3 years. Anyone who couldn't see your value was a fool. Heat crept up Ivy's neck. She wasn't used to compliments, especially not from men who looked at her like she was actually worth something. Thank you, she managed. I'm the one who should be thanking you. You didn't have to come here, didn't have to stay, but you did, and it's made a difference. I haven't done anything yet. Silas still doesn't speak. No, but he watches you, follows you, draws you. Gideon's mouth twitched in what might have been a smile. That's more than he's done for anyone since Sarah died. Sarah, his wife's name. Ivy had heard it only once before, and Gideon had looked like speaking it caused physical pain. She was a good woman, Gideon continued, staring at his hands. Kind, patient, everything I wasn't. When she got sick, it happened so fast. 1 week she was fine, the next she was burning up with fever, and then she was just gone. I'm sorry. Silas saw everything, was with her when she stopped breathing. I was out checking the fences, didn't make it back in time. His voice cracked. My son watched his mother die alone because I was too stubborn to admit she was sick enough to need a doctor sooner. Gideon, he hasn't spoken since because I failed him. Failed both of them. Ivy set down her tea and moved to sit across from him at the table. You didn't fail anyone. You couldn't have known how fast the fever would take her. I should have been there. Maybe, but you can't change that now. All you can do is be here for him now. And you are. You didn't send him away when people told you to. You didn't give up on him. That counts for something. Gideon looked at her, and in the dim light from the stove, she saw tears tracking down his weathered face. I don't know how to reach him, he whispered. Then we figure it out together. The word we hung between them, bigger than Ivy had intended. She'd meant it practically. They were both trying to help Silas, but it came out sounding like something else. Like a promise. Like partnership. Gideon didn't correct her. He just nodded slowly and wiped his face with his sleeve. They sat there in the dark kitchen, drinking tea that had gone cold, while somewhere upstairs Silas slept the restless sleep of a child who'd seen too much. And Ivy realized, with a clarity that was almost frightening, that she'd somehow become invested in this broken family. That their pain had become her pain, their struggle, her struggle. She couldn't have said when it happened. Maybe that first day in the market square. Maybe the first sunset they'd watched together. Maybe tonight, sitting across from a grieving father who was finally letting someone see how much he was drowning. But it had happened, and there was no going back now. The next morning, Ivy started something new. She set up a small table in the kitchen, covered it with paper and pencils she'd found in the attic, and left it there like it had always belonged. Silas noticed it immediately when he came down for breakfast. He circled the table like a suspicious cat, never quite touching it but clearly interested. Thought maybe you'd like a place to draw down here, Ivy said casually, focusing on the eggs she was scrambling. The attic's nice, but it's not very warm, and the light's better down here. Silas stared at the table, then at her. No pressure, Ivy continued. It's there if you want it, or you can keep using the attic, whatever feels right. She served breakfast and ate her own meal in silence, pretending she didn't notice Silas hovering near the drawing table. When she got up to clear the dishes, she found one sheet of paper with a single sketch on it. It showed her standing at the stove, drawn in quick, confident lines, and in the corner, almost too small to read, "Thank you." Ivy's hands shook slightly as she set the paper aside. "You're welcome," she said to the empty kitchen. But Silas had already slipped away, leaving behind only the sketch and the faintest suggestion that maybe, possibly, they were starting to understand each other. The days grew colder as autumn deepened. Ivy spent more time inside, which meant she spent more time in Silas's orbit. The boy had started leaving drawings for her to find, on the kitchen table, tucked into books, folded under her door. Each one showed some aspect of ranch life, and each one had a small message hidden somewhere in the details. She started leaving him notes in return, written simply, and placed where he'd find them. Your drawing of the barn is beautiful. You have real talent. I saw you watching me bake today. Would you like to help next time? The sunset was especially pretty tonight. Glad we watched it together. They were having a conversation, Ivy realized. A slow, careful conversation conducted entirely through written words and shared moments of silence. It wasn't what anyone else would have called progress, but it was something. Gideon noticed the change too. Ivy would catch him watching her and Silas during meals, his expression unreadable. Once she found him standing outside Silas's door, listening to the scratch of pencil on paper, and the look on his face was so raw it hurt to witness. "He's getting better," Ivy told him one evening after Silas had gone to bed. "Is he? Or is he just getting better at hiding?" The question was fair. Ivy didn't have an answer. "I think," she said carefully, "that he's learning it's safe to express himself again. That's the first step." To what? To healing, to maybe speaking again someday. Or maybe not. Maybe he finds other ways to communicate, and that's okay too. Gideon absorbed this quietly. "You really believe that? That it's okay if he never talks again?" "I believe people communicate in lots of ways. Words are just one option." Ivy met his gaze. "Your son isn't broken, Gideon. He's just different now. And different isn't the same as wrong." Something shifted in Gideon's expression, surprise maybe, or gratitude. "How'd you get so smart about this?" "I'm not smart. I just know what it's like when people expect you to be something you can't be. When they treat you like you're broken because you don't fit their idea of normal." She hadn't meant to say that much, to reveal that much of herself. But Gideon didn't look away, didn't dismiss her words. Instead, he said quietly, "Their loss," for the second time since she'd arrived. And Ivy felt something warm and dangerous bloom in her chest, something that felt dangerously close to hope. That night, a storm rolled through the valley. Ivy woke to thunder so loud it shook the windows. Rain hammered against the roof like it had a personal grudge against the house. She lay in bed, listening to the violence of the weather, and wondered if the ranch would flood. Then she heard the crying, soft, muffled, coming from somewhere down the hall. Silas. Ivy threw on her robe and hurried toward his room. The door was ajar, and through it she could see him huddled in the corner, hands over his ears, rocking slightly. "Silas?" she said softly. "Can I come in?" The boy didn't respond, didn't look at her, but he didn't shake his head either. Ivy entered slowly, careful to move predictably. She sat down on the floor a few feet away from him, close enough to be present but far enough to not be threatening. "Storms are scary," she said quietly, pitching her voice under the thunder. "I don't like them much either. All that noise and violence makes you feel small." Another crack of thunder. Silas flinched, pressing himself harder into the corner. Ivy started humming, not a lullaby exactly, just a simple tune her mother had hummed when Ivy was small and afraid, before things had gone wrong between them, before Ivy had become an embarrassment her family wanted to forget. The tune was nothing special, but it gave her something to do besides sit there uselessly. She hummed and watched Silas slowly, incrementally, begin to relax. The storm raged on. Ivy kept humming. She didn't know when Gideon appeared in the doorway, didn't realize he was there until she glanced up and saw him standing in the shadows, watching them with an expression that made her chest tight. Their eyes met. Gideon mouthed something that might have been "thank you" or "sorry" or something else entirely. Then he turned and went back to his room, leaving Ivy alone with his son in the storm. Eventually, the thunder moved on. The rain softened to a steady drum, and Silas, exhausted from fear and adrenaline, fell asleep right there in the corner. Ivy covered him with a blanket from his bed and slipped out quietly, closing the door behind her. Back in her own room, she stood at the window and watched lightning flash in the distance, painting the valley in brief moments of stark clarity. She was in too deep now. She knew that. These people weren't her family. This ranch wasn't her home. She was hired help, temporary, someone who'd be let go once Silas got better, or once Gideon decided she wasn't worth the expense. But somewhere in the last few weeks, she'd stopped thinking of this as a job and started thinking of it as a life. And that was dangerous, because nothing in Ivy Mercer's life had ever been permanent, and she had no reason to believe this would be any different. The next morning dawned clear and cold. Ivy found a drawing slipped under her door while she'd slept. It showed her sitting on the floor of Silas's room, humming while the storm raged outside his window. And in the corner, in that careful, cramped handwriting, "You stayed when it got loud." Ivy pressed the drawing to her chest and let herself cry for just a moment. Then she wiped her face, put on her boots, and went downstairs to make breakfast for a family that was slowly, painfully learning how to be whole again. The trouble started on a Tuesday, 6 weeks after Ivy had arrived at the ranch. She'd gone into Blackthorn Ridge with Gideon to pick up supplies. Her first trip back to town since leaving. She'd tried to avoid it, making excuses about needing to stay with Silas or having too much work at the ranch. But Gideon had insisted they needed more than he could carry alone, and the hands were busy with fence repairs. So Ivy found herself sitting beside him on the wagon bench, watching the familiar buildings of Blackthorn Ridge emerge from the morning mist like something from a bad dream she'd thought she'd escaped. "You all right?" Gideon asked, glancing at her. "Fine, just haven't been back since I left." "People give you trouble here?" "Some. Most just ignored me." She smoothed her skirt, aware of how much better she looked now than she had 6 weeks ago. Regular meals had filled out her face. Hard work had given her color. She stood straighter, carried herself different. "I don't expect that's changed much." She was wrong. They'd barely pulled the wagon to a stop outside the general store when Ivy felt the stares. Not the casual mockery she'd endured before, but something sharper, more focused. Martha Hendricks stood outside her stall, whispering furiously to 2 other women. All 3 went silent when they saw Ivy climb down from the wagon. "Well," Martha said loudly enough to carry, "look who came crawling back. Thought you'd run off for good, Ivy." "Just picking up supplies, Martha." "Supplies. Right." Martha's eyes flicked to Gideon, then back to Ivy with an expression that made Ivy's stomach turn. "Heard you been playing house with the Vale family. That true? I'm employed by Mr. Vale to help with his son." "That what they're calling it now?" Heat flooded Ivy's face. "Excuse me?" "Nothing. Just interesting is all. Big woman like you living alone with a man and his boy. People talk." Gideon had been unloading the wagon, but at this he straightened and turned to face Martha. His expression could have cut glass. "Mrs. Hendricks, I suggest you mind your business." "Just making conversation, Mr. Vale. No offense intended." "Yes, there was, and I'll thank you to keep my family's name out of your mouth." Martha's face went red, but she pressed her lips together and turned away. The other women scattered like startled birds. Ivy stood frozen, processing what had just happened. Gideon had called her family, or at least he'd included her when he said "my family." It probably didn't mean anything, just a figure of speech, but her heart had done something complicated anyway. "Come on," Gideon said quietly, touching her elbow. "Let's get what we need and get out of here." They made their way through the store quickly, gathering flour and sugar and other necessities. But Ivy felt eyes on her the entire time, heard whispers that cut off when she got too close. At the counter, while Gideon paid for their supplies, Ivy noticed a well-dressed woman watching her from the fabric section. Tall, elegant, wearing clothes that probably cost more than Ivy had earned in a year of selling preserves. Miriam Crowley. Ivy had never spoken to the woman, but everyone in Blackthorn Ridge knew who she was. Wife of Thomas Crowley, the wealthiest rancher in 3 counties, unofficial queen of the territory's social hierarchy, the kind of woman who could destroy reputations with a single well-placed rumor. Their eyes met across the store. Miriam's expression was cold, assessing, finding Ivy lacking in every possible way. Then she smiled. Not friendly, calculating. Ivy looked away first, hating herself for the cowardice, but unable to hold that piercing gaze. "Ready?" Gideon asked, arms full of packages. "Yes. Let's go." They loaded the wagon in silence and headed out of town. Ivy didn't relax until Blackthorn Ridge was a shrinking dot behind them. "Don't let them get to you," Gideon said after a few miles. "Martha's always been a gossip. Got nothing better to do than make other people miserable. She thinks I'm sleeping with you." The words came out blunt, graceless. Gideon nearly dropped the reins. "What?" "You heard her. Playing house, that's what she called it. She thinks I'm warming your bed in exchange for room and board." Gideon's jaw clenched. "That's ridiculous. You're hired help. You're here for Silas." "I know that. You know that. But they don't care about truth. They care about having something to talk about." Ivy stared at her hands. A fat woman living alone with a widower? That's scandal enough for people like Martha. You're not... Gideon stopped himself. Not what? Not fat? Ivy laughed bitterly. I have eyes, Gideon. I know what I look like. And I know what people see when they look at me. They see someone who's kept my son alive when everyone else wanted him locked away. They see someone who's brought my house back from the dead. They see... He stopped again, frustrated. They see what they want to see, and it says more about them than it does about you. Ivy didn't respond. She'd heard variations of this speech before, from the few kind people who'd tried to make her feel better about the mockery she endured. It never helped. They rode the rest of the way in uncomfortable silence, but Martha's words had planted seeds, and seeds had a way of growing in dark places. That night at supper, Ivy found herself hyper-aware of every interaction with Gideon, the way he thanked her for the meal, the way their hands briefly touched when he passed her the salt, the way he lingered in the kitchen after eating, like he was reluctant to leave. Was she giving people reasons to talk? Was she being inappropriate somehow without realizing it? She started pulling back. Small things at first. She stopped watching sunsets from the front window where Gideon might see her. Started eating earlier so they wouldn't overlap at meals as often. Made excuses to stay busy when he was around. Gideon noticed. Of course he noticed. You avoiding me? He asked one evening, cornering her in the kitchen. No, just busy. Ivy. What? Look at me. She forced herself to meet his eyes. Did I do something wrong? He asked quietly. No, of course not. Then why does it feel like you're packing your bags even though you're still here? The observation was too accurate. Ivy felt exposed, vulnerable in a way she hated. People in town are talking, she said finally. About us, about me being here. So? So I don't want to cause problems for you or Silas. The only problem is that you're suddenly treating me like a stranger. Gideon leaned against the counter, arms crossed. I don't give a damn what people in town think. Never have. And you shouldn't either. Easy for you to say. You belong here. You're respected. I'm just what? Just the woman who saved my son? Just the person who made this place feel like a home again? His voice dropped. You matter, Ivy. To me. To Silas. Don't let Martha Hendricks make you forget that. Ivy's throat tightened. I'm not good at this. At what? At mattering to people. Every time I start to think I belong somewhere, something happens to remind me I don't. Gideon was quiet for a long moment. Then he pushed off the counter and moved closer, close enough that Ivy had to tilt her head back to keep looking at him. You belong here, he said firmly, and anyone who says different is wrong. He left before she could respond, leaving Ivy alone with his words and the dangerous warmth spreading through her chest. She wanted to believe him, wanted to think that maybe, this time, she'd found a place where she could stay, but experience had taught her better than to hope. 2 weeks later, everything got worse. Ivy was in town again, this time alone, to pick up thread for mending. She tried to make the trip quick, in and out before anyone could corner her. But as she left the general store, she found her path blocked by Miriam Crowley and 2 other well-dressed women Ivy didn't recognize. Miss Mercer, Miriam said with that same calculating smile, how fortunate to run into you. We've been meaning to have a conversation. Ivy's instincts screamed danger, but she couldn't exactly flee. Mrs. Crowley, ladies, we've heard such interesting things about your arrangement with Mr. Vale. So charitable of you to help with his unfortunate son. The word unfortunate dripped with condescension. Silas is a good boy, Ivy said carefully. Oh, I'm sure, though one has to wonder if isolating him on that ranch with no proper education or medical care is really in the child's best interest. He receives excellent care. From you? A woman with no training, no qualifications, no family of her own? Miriam's smile sharpened. Forgive me, but that seems rather irresponsible. What if the boy needs real help? Professional help? He has what he needs. Does he? Because from what I understand, the child still hasn't spoken. 3 years of silence, and you're no closer to fixing him than those expensive doctors were. Ivy's hands clenched around her package. Silas isn't broken. He doesn't need fixing. So you're content to let him remain mute? To never attend school? Never learn to function in society? Never have a normal life? Miriam shook her head with false sympathy. That sounds less like helping and more like enabling. Some might even call it neglect. That's not... And Mr. Vale, poor man, so blinded by grief that he can't see how this arrangement is harming his son. Someone should intervene before more damage is done. The threat was clear. Ivy felt ice slide down her spine. Mrs. Crowley, I don't know what you think you know about the Vale family, but I know that you're a stranger who insinuated herself into a vulnerable household. I know that you have no credentials, no references, no business caring for a traumatized child. And I know that people in positions of authority, doctors, judges, people who matter, would be very interested to learn about this situation. One of the other women leaned in, her voice pitched to sound concerned rather than cruel. We're only thinking of the boy's welfare, Miss Mercer. Surely you understand that a proper institution with trained professionals would be better equipped to help him than a woman who sells jam at market. The casual dismissal of everything Ivy had accomplished stung more than outright mockery would have. Silas is thriving, she said, fighting to keep her voice steady. He's engaged. He's communicating in his own way. He's not speaking, Miriam interrupted. Still not speaking. After months under your care, that tells us everything we need to know about your competence. You don't understand what you're talking about. Don't I? I understand that a child's future is at stake. I understand that Mr. Vale's judgment has been compromised by his circumstances. And I understand that sometimes unpleasant decisions must be made for the greater good. Miriam stepped closer, and Ivy caught the scent of expensive perfume mixed with something that smelled like malice. Here's what's going to happen, Miss Mercer. You're going to leave that ranch. You're going to remove yourself from the Vale family's life before you cause any more harm. And if you don't... She paused, letting the threat hang. If you don't, I'll be forced to contact the proper authorities. I have friends in high places. A county physician who owes me favors, a territorial judge who values my husband's political support. They would be very interested to inspect the conditions under which that poor silent child is being raised. The world tilted. Ivy understood exactly what Miriam was threatening. An official investigation. Possible removal of Silas from his father's care. The boy sent to one of those horrific frontier institutions where damaged children were locked away and forgotten. Why are you doing this? Ivy whispered. Because people like you need to understand their place. You don't belong in our territory, certainly not in a position of influence over a prominent family. You're an embarrassment, Miss Mercer, a fat, unmarried woman playing at being something she's not. And I won't stand by while you drag the Vale name through the mud with your presence. The other women nodded in agreement, their faces showing the same mix of superiority and disgust. Ivy wanted to fight back, wanted to defend herself, defend Silas, defend everything they'd built together. But what weapons did she have? Miriam was right about one thing. Ivy had no credentials, no standing, no power. She was nobody, just like she'd always been. Think about what I said, Miriam finished, turning to leave. You have 1 week to make the right decision. After that, I'll make it for you. They swept away, leaving Ivy standing alone on the boardwalk, trembling with anger and fear. She made it to the wagon before she started crying. Big, ugly sobs that shook her whole body. She'd been stupid to think this could last. Stupid to believe she could matter to anyone. Stupid to hope. The ride back to the ranch was a blur. Ivy barely remembered guiding the horse home, barely remembered unhitching the wagon or putting away the supplies. She found Silas in the kitchen, drawing at his table. He looked up when she entered, and his face immediately registered concern. He stood, moving toward her with his pencil still in hand. Ivy tried to smile, to pretend everything was fine, but her face wouldn't cooperate. Silas reached out slowly, carefully, and touched her hand. It was the first time he'd initiated physical contact with her. Ever. The gesture broke something inside Ivy. She sank into a chair and covered her face with her hands. Silas stood beside her, his small hand still resting on hers, and Ivy heard the scratch of pencil on paper as he wrote something. When she finally looked up, there was a note on the table. What's wrong? Ivy wiped her eyes. Nothing you need to worry about, sweetheart. But Silas grabbed another piece of paper and wrote furiously. Don't lie. I see everything. What happened? She'd forgotten how perceptive he was. How much he noticed despite his silence. There are people in town who think I'm not good for you. she said carefully. Who think you'd be better off with? Someone else. Professionals. Silas's eyes went wide with understanding and fear. He wrote again, the letters big and urgent. No, you stay, please. It's not that simple. But Silas was already writing more, sheets of paper filling up with his desperate attempts to communicate. You're different. You don't hurt. You don't make me wrong. You stay. You stay. You stay. Ivy read the repeated phrase and felt her heart break completely. When Gideon came in for supper an hour later, he found them still at the kitchen table, Ivy crying quietly and Silas standing guard beside her like he could physically prevent whatever was threatening her from getting close. What happened? Gideon demanded, taking in the scene. Ivy told him, all of it. Miriam's threats, the promise of an official investigation, the 1-week deadline. Gideon's face went through several expressions: shock, anger, fear, and finally a cold fury that was somehow worse than rage. She can't do this. She can, Ivy said. She has the connections, the power, and she's right about me. I have no credentials, no legal standing, nothing that would prove I'm qualified to care for Silas. You're doing better than anyone else has done. That won't matter to a judge. Not when Miriam Crowley's whispering in his ear. Gideon paced the kitchen, running his hands through his hair. There has to be something we can do. Some way to fight this. Fight with what? I'm nobody, Gideon. A fat woman who sold preserves at market, and you're... She stopped. I'm what? You're vulnerable right now. A widower raising a silent child, already struggling to keep the ranch going. If they investigate, if they decide Silas is being neglected or harmed, they won't just remove him. They'll destroy you too. So what are you saying? That we just surrender? Ivy looked at Silas, still standing protective beside her chair. Looked at Gideon, desperate and furious and terrified of losing his son. And she made the hardest decision of her life. I'm saying I won't be the reason this family gets torn apart. Ivy, no. Listen to me. Miriam's right about one thing. My presence here is making you vulnerable. If I leave, if I'm not in the picture anymore, they have no case. Silas is with his father, on his family ranch, being raised by his own blood. There's nothing to investigate. You can't leave, Gideon said flatly. I have to. What about Silas? What about the progress he's made? He'll be okay. He was surviving before I came. He'll survive after I'm gone. That's not the same as thriving. You know that. Maybe. But at least he'll still be here. With you. Safe. Ivy stood up, her legs shaky. If I stay and Miriam follows through on her threats, Silas could end up in an institution. I won't risk that. I can't. Silas had been following this conversation with growing panic. Now he grabbed more paper and started writing frantically, showing the notes to both of them. Don't go. I'll be good. I'll try to talk. Please don't go. Not like Mama. Please. The last note shattered them all. Gideon knelt beside his son, pulling him into a fierce hug. Hey, this isn't your fault. None of this is your fault. But Silas was shaking, and Ivy saw the terror in his eyes, the same terror he must have felt when his mother got sick, when the world proved it could take away everyone he loved without warning. I'm sorry, Ivy whispered. I'm so sorry. She fled upstairs to her room and closed the door, leaning against it while she tried to breathe through the pain. This was what she deserved, really. She'd let herself care, let herself hope, let herself believe for a few brief months that she could be part of something good. But people like her didn't get happy endings. They got exactly what Ivy was getting now, a reminder that they didn't belong anywhere, with anyone, ever. She started packing. The next few days were torture. Ivy tried to maintain some semblance of normalcy, cooking meals, tending the garden, keeping the house running. But everyone knew she was leaving, and the knowledge hung over the ranch like a storm cloud. Silas stopped eating, stopped drawing, spent most of his time in his room with the door closed, and when Ivy tried to check on him, she found the door locked. Gideon became distant, throwing himself into ranch work with an intensity that bordered on self-destruction. The few times they spoke, their conversations were stilted, careful, both of them dancing around the thing they couldn't change. You don't have to do this, he said on the third night, finding her in the kitchen after everyone else had gone to bed. Yes, I do. We could fight, hire a lawyer, contest any investigation. With what money, Gideon? You're barely keeping this ranch afloat as it is. He flinched. I'd find a way. And what happens if you lose? What happens when Miriam's judge friend decides Silas is better off in an institution? At least this way he stays with you. At what cost? Ivy met his eyes. That's not your problem anymore. Like hell it isn't. Gideon moved closer, and Ivy saw something fierce in his expression. You think I don't know what you've done here? You think I don't see how you've changed everything? The house, my son, me? You matter, Ivy. Not just to Silas, to me too. The confession hung between them, raw and vulnerable. Don't, Ivy whispered. Please don't make this harder. Why? Because you're scared? Because it's easier to run than to fight? The accusation stung because it was true. Ivy had spent her whole life running, from families who didn't want her, from towns that mocked her, from anything that might hurt her if she stayed too long. I'm not running, she lied. I'm protecting you. By leaving? By proving Miriam right, that you're someone who can be scared off, someone who doesn't matter enough to fight for. I never said I mattered enough to fight for. Well, you're wrong. You do. To both of us. Gideon reached out like he might touch her, then stopped himself. Stay, please. We'll figure this out together. Ivy wanted to say yes, wanted to believe they could win against someone like Miriam Crowley, but she'd learned the hard way that hope was dangerous, that believing in impossible things only made the fall hurt worse. I can't, she said. I'm sorry. She left him standing in the kitchen and went upstairs to finish packing. 2 days later, before dawn, Ivy made her final preparations to leave. She'd written notes for both Gideon and Silas, though she had no confidence the words would help. What could she say that would make this better? Sorry I'm abandoning you? Sorry I'm not strong enough to fight for this family? She left Gideon's note on the kitchen table. Silas's note, along with the journal she'd been keeping, filled with observations about him, memories of their time together, all the small ways he'd changed and grown. She slid under his door. Then she picked up her traveling bag, collected her cat, and walked down the stairs for the last time. The house was quiet. Outside, the first hints of dawn were lightening the eastern sky. Ivy made it to the front door before she stopped. She couldn't do it. Couldn't leave without seeing the sunset view one more time, even though it was sunrise and the light was all wrong. She set down her bag and walked to the window where she'd stood so many evenings with Silas beside her, watching the day end in fire and gold. The valley was beautiful in the pre-dawn light. Mist hung low over the pastures. The mountains were black silhouettes against the slowly brightening sky. She'd been happy here. For the first time in longer than she could remember, Ivy had been genuinely happy. And now she was throwing it away because she was too afraid to fight, too convinced of her own worthlessness to believe she deserved to stay. Miriam had been right about one thing. Ivy did know her place. And her place was always somewhere else, always leaving, always alone. She picked up her bag again and forced herself toward the door. She made it all the way to the front gate before her legs gave out, and she sank onto the ground beneath an old oak tree, unable to go any farther. The sun rose. The valley came alive with morning sounds, and Ivy sat there with her cat carrier in her bag, crying like the world was ending, because in a lot of ways it was. She didn't know how long she sat there beneath that oak tree, watching the sun climb higher and turn the morning mist to gold. Time felt broken, moving too fast and too slow all at once. Her cat meowed plaintively from inside the carrier, confused about why they'd stopped moving. Ivy wiped her face with her sleeve and tried to stand. Her legs shook. She made it upright, grabbed her bag, then looked back at the ranch house. Just one more look, that's all. The front door was still closed. No smoke from the chimney yet. The whole place looked peaceful, like it was still sleeping, unaware that she'd tried to leave. Ivy turned away and took 3 steps down the road. That's when she heard it. The sound came from the house. Not loud, but sharp enough to carry in the morning quiet. A crash. Something breaking. Then raised voices. She froze. It wasn't her business anymore. She was leaving. Whatever was happening in that house would have to happen without her. But her feet wouldn't move forward. Another crash, louder this time. Ivy dropped her bag and ran. She burst through this front door to find Gideon at the bottom of the stairs, staring up at Silas's closed door. The boy's room was making sounds Ivy had never heard from it before. Furniture being overturned, objects hitting walls, the kind of destruction that came from complete emotional collapse. "How long has this been going on?" Ivy demanded. Gideon turned. His face was haggard, like he hadn't slept at all. "You came back. How long?" "Since he woke up and found your note. He locked himself in there and started—" Another crash from upstairs cut him off. "I can't get him to open the door, can't get him to stop. He's destroying everything." Ivy took the stairs two at a time. At Silas's door, she pressed her ear against the wood and heard ragged breathing, the sound of paper tearing, something that might have been sobbing. "Silas?" she called. "Silas, it's me. It's Ivy." The sounds inside stopped abruptly. "I need you to open the door, sweetheart. I need to know you're okay." Nothing. "Please. I know you're angry. I know you're hurt, and you have every right to be, but I need to see that you're safe." Still nothing. Ivy leaned her forehead against the door. "I'm sorry I tried to leave. I'm sorry I scared you. I thought I was protecting you, but I can see now that I was just being a coward." The lock clicked. The door opened a crack, and Ivy's heart broke at what she saw. Silas's room looked like a tornado had hit it. Every drawing had been torn from the walls. His bed was overturned. Books and pencils were scattered everywhere. And in the middle of the destruction stood Silas himself, small and pale and shaking, with tear tracks cutting through the dust on his face. He was holding her journal, the one she'd left under his door, clutched against his chest like it was the only solid thing in the world. "Oh, baby," Ivy whispered. She stepped into the room carefully, mindful of the debris. Silas didn't move, just stood there trembling. "Can I come closer?" The boy nodded fractionally. Ivy picked her way through the wreckage until she was standing right in front of him. Up close, she could see he'd been crying for a while. His eyes were red and swollen, his breathing still hitched. "I'm here," she said quietly. "I came back." Silas made a sound, not quite a word, more like a wounded animal. Then he dropped the journal and threw his arms around her waist, burying his face in her stomach. Ivy wrapped her arms around him and held on while he shook with silent sobs. Over his head, she saw Gideon standing in the doorway, watching them with an expression that was equal parts relief and devastation. "I'm sorry," Ivy said to both of them. "I'm so sorry." They stayed like that for a long time, Silas clinging to Ivy like she might disappear if he let go, and Ivy holding him like she could keep the whole world from hurting him through sheer force of will. Finally, the boy's breathing began to steady. He pulled back slightly and looked up at her, and the question in his eyes was clear even without words. "Are you staying?" "I don't know," Ivy admitted. "I want to, but there are people who want me gone, who think I'm bad for you, and if they follow through on their threats—" Silas shook his head violently. He pulled away, grabbed a piece of paper from the floor, and started writing with a pencil stub he'd been clutching in his fist. His handwriting was messier than usual, frantic, but the words were clear. "Not bad. Good. You're good. They're wrong. Don't believe them. Please." More writing, faster now. "You see me. You don't try to fix me. You just let me be me. Nobody else does that. Nobody." Tears were streaming down his face again as he wrote. "When Mama died, the world got loud and scary and I couldn't make words anymore. They tried to make me, doctors and Papa and everyone, but I couldn't. The words were stuck." He looked up at her, and Ivy saw 3 years of pain and fear in those brown eyes. "Then you came," he wrote, "and you didn't make me use words. You just talked to me like I was still a person, like I still mattered even though I was broken." "You're not broken," Ivy said fiercely. "I know," Silas wrote in huge letters. "I know that now, because you showed me." He grabbed more paper, his hand shaking. "If you leave, I'll forget again. I'll go back to being the broken boy nobody wants. Please don't make me go back to that. Please." Gideon had moved into the room without Ivy noticing. He knelt down beside Silas and read the notes over his son's shoulder. When he looked up at Ivy, his eyes were wet. "He's right," Gideon said roughly, "about all of it. You showed both of us that we were still worth something, that we could still have a life instead of just surviving. If you leave now—" His voice broke. "If you leave now, I don't know if we'll find our way back from that." "But Miriam—" "Damn Miriam Crowley. Damn all of them." Gideon stood up, something fierce and determined settling over his features. I've spent 3 years being afraid. Afraid of losing my son, afraid of failing him, afraid of moving forward because moving forward felt like forgetting Sarah. And I let that fear control every decision I made. He looked at Silas, then at Ivy. I'm done being afraid. If Miriam wants a fight, she'll get one. But I'm not letting her take away the best thing that's happened to this family in 3 years. You don't understand what you're up against, Ivy protested. She has money, connections, power. And I have the truth. I have a son who's made more progress in 3 months with you than he made in 3 years without you. I have a house that feels like a home again. He stopped, swallowed hard. I have someone who makes me want to fight instead of just surrender. The weight of what he was saying settled over Ivy like a blanket. Gideon, I can't let you risk everything for me. You're not letting me do anything. I'm choosing this. We both are. He gestured to Silas, who was nodding emphatically. The question is, are you brave enough to choose it too? Was she? Ivy had spent her entire life running from conflict, from judgment, from anything that might hurt her. She'd convinced herself it was self-preservation, but maybe it was just cowardice dressed up in practical clothing. She looked at Silas, still clutching those desperate notes. Looked at Gideon, standing there offering her something she'd never had before. Someone willing to fight for her instead of against her. And she made a choice that terrified her. Okay, she said. Okay, I'll stay. Silas made that wounded animal sound again and grabbed her in another fierce hug. Over his head, Ivy met Gideon's eyes and saw relief so profound it was almost painful to witness. We'll figure this out, Gideon promised. Together. Ivy nodded, not trusting her voice. She just hoped he was right. The next few days were strange. Ivy had unpacked her bag, reclaimed her room, but everything felt different now. There was a tension in the air, anticipation mixed with dread. Miriam's 1-week deadline was approaching, and none of them knew what would happen when it arrived. Gideon threw himself into preparing a defense. He wrote letters to people he knew in the territory, calling in favors, asking for character witnesses. He documented Silas's progress, the drawings, the written communications, the small but significant ways the boy had improved since Ivy's arrival. If they send someone to investigate, Gideon said, spreading papers across the kitchen table, we need to show them evidence, proof that Silas is better off here with you than he would be anywhere else. What if it's not enough? Ivy asked quietly. Then we'll deal with that when it comes. But I'm not giving up without a fight. Silas had become clingy in a way he hadn't been before. He followed Ivy everywhere, as if afraid she'd disappear if he looked away too long. At night, she'd find him sitting outside her bedroom door, keeping watch like a small, silent guardian. You need to sleep in your own bed, she told him gently, after the third night of finding him in the hallway. He wrote her a note in response. What if you leave while I'm sleeping? I won't, I promise. You promised before. Then you tried to go. The accusation stung because it was true. You're right, Ivy admitted. I did. And I was wrong. But I'm not going anywhere now. You're stuck with me. Silas studied her face for a long moment, then wrote, Good. That night, Ivy found a drawing slipped under her door. It showed the three of them, Gideon, Silas, and Ivy, standing together in front of the ranch house. They were holding hands, forming a chain, and underneath Silas had written 2 words, My family. Ivy pressed the drawing to her chest and cried quietly into her pillow, overwhelmed by the trust this boy was placing in her. Terrified she'd fail him somehow, but also, for the first time in her life, feeling like she belonged somewhere. The week passed too quickly. When the day of Miriam's deadline arrived, Ivy woke with her stomach in knots. She went through the motions of making breakfast, but nobody ate much. The food sat congealing on their plates while they all tried to pretend everything was normal. Around mid-morning, they heard hoofbeats approaching. Gideon stood up from the table, his jaw set. Stay inside, both of you. No, Ivy said. If they're here about me, I should face them. Ivy, I'm done hiding. They walked to the porch together. Silas pressed himself against Ivy's side, one hand gripping her skirt. The riders came into view, 3 of them. Miriam Crowley on a beautiful chestnut mare, looking imperious and satisfied. Beside her, a thin man with a medical bag who must be the county physician. And behind them, a gray-haired man in official-looking clothes who could only be the territorial judge. They stopped in front of the house and dismounted. Miriam's smile was sharp as broken glass. Mr. Vale, Miss Mercer, how unfortunate that it's come to this. State your business, Gideon said flatly. The judge stepped forward, removing his hat. I'm Judge Harrison Blackwood. I've received concerning reports about the welfare of a minor child on this property. I'm here to conduct an official investigation. On whose authority? Mine, as appointed representative of the territorial government. Mrs. Crowley has raised questions about the living conditions and care being provided to your son, Mr. Vale. Questions serious enough to warrant examination. Gideon's hands clenched at his sides, but his voice stayed level. My son is well cared for. That's what we're here to determine. The physician spoke up, his voice nasal and condescending. I'm Dr. Edmund Pierce. I'll need to examine the boy, physically and mentally, assess whether he's receiving appropriate medical attention. He doesn't need medical attention. He needs to be left alone. A child who hasn't spoken in 3 years clearly needs professional intervention, Dr. Pierce countered. Allowing him to continue in this state without proper treatment borders on neglect. He's not neglected, Ivy said, her voice stronger than she felt. He's loved and cared for and making progress. Miriam laughed, a cold, brittle sound. Progress? The boy is still mute, Miss Mercer, after months under your so-called care. That's not progress, that's failure. You don't know what you're talking about, don't I? I know that you're an unqualified woman playing at being a governess or teacher or whatever you're pretending to be. I know that you've insinuated yourself into a vulnerable household and convinced a grieving widower to trust you with his damaged son. Silas isn't damaged, Ivy snapped. He's traumatized. There's a difference. Not to the law, Judge Blackwood interjected. What matters is whether the child is receiving adequate care and whether his current situation serves his best interests. That's what I'm here to determine. He looked at Silas, who had gone completely still against Ivy's side. Hello, son. I'm Judge Blackwood. I'd like to ask you some questions. Would that be all right? Silas didn't respond, didn't move. Can you tell me your name? Nothing. Do you understand what I'm saying? Still nothing. Silas's eyes had gone distant, unfocused. Ivy recognized the expression. He was retreating inward, the way he did when the world became too overwhelming. You see, Dr. Pierce said to the judge, completely unresponsive. Classic signs of severe trauma that's gone untreated for far too long. He's not unresponsive, Gideon growled. He's scared. You're strangers who showed up at his home making demands. How do you expect him to react? A healthy child would still be able to communicate in some fashion, Dr. Pierce replied. This level of withdrawal suggests deep psychological damage. The boy needs institutional care, not whatever amateur attempts at treatment he's receiving here. I'd like to see the child's living quarters, Judge Blackwood said, and any documentation of his condition, progress, or lack thereof. You have no right, Gideon started. Actually, I do. As an officer of the territorial court investigating potential child welfare violations, I have every right to inspect these premises. You can cooperate willingly, or I can return with a formal court order. Your choice. The threat was clear. Gideon looked at Ivy, his expression helpless. Fine, he said through clenched teeth, but I'm coming with you. As you wish. Mrs. Crowley, Dr. Pierce, you'll accompany me as witnesses. They filed into the house. Ivy started to follow, but Miriam blocked her path. You should have left when I gave you the chance, Miriam said quietly, maliciously. Now you'll watch everything you've built here get torn apart. That boy will be in an institution by the end of the month, and his father will spend the rest of his life knowing he chose wrong, all because you were too stubborn to know your place. My place is here, Ivy said. With them. Your place is in whatever gutter will take you, and after today, everyone in the territory will know it. Miriam swept inside, leaving Ivy on the porch with Silas still pressed against her side. She looked down at the boy. His face was pale, his breathing shallow. He was terrified. She could feel it radiating off him in waves. It's going to be okay, she lied. Your father won't let them take you. But Silas knew better. He pulled away from her and ran, not into the house where the adults were, but toward the barn. Silas, Ivy called, but he was already gone. She should have followed him, should have made sure he was safe. But she needed to know what was happening inside, needed to be there to defend herself and Gideon and everything they'd built. So she made a choice she'd regret for the rest of her life. She went inside and left Silas alone. The inspection was brutal. Judge Blackwood examined every room, made notes in a leather journal, asked pointed questions about Silas's education, medical care, and daily routine. Dr. Pierce poked through Gideon's attempts at documentation with barely concealed disdain. "These drawings," he said, holding up one of Silas's sketches, "you're treating them as communication?" "Because they are communication," Gideon insisted. "He expresses himself through art. Art is not a substitute for speech. The boy needs to learn to function in society, not retreat further into silence." "He's not retreating. He's processing trauma in the only way he knows how." "And who diagnosed that? You? Miss Mercer?" Dr. Pierce's contempt was palpable. "Neither of you has any medical training. You're experimenting on this child based on nothing but guesswork and hope." "We're loving him," Ivy said. "That's not an experiment. Love without competence is just neglect with good intentions." Judge Blackwood held up a hand. "That's enough. I've seen what I need to see here. Let's speak with the boy directly." They went looking for Silas and couldn't find him. Not in his room, not in the kitchen, not anywhere in the house. "Where is he?" Judge Blackwood demanded. "He ran outside," Ivy admitted. "He was scared." "So you left a traumatized child alone during a stressful situation? That demonstrates remarkably poor judgment, Miss Mercer." Panic clawed at Ivy's throat. "He just needed space. He'll come back." "We need to find him now," the judge said. They split up to search. Gideon headed for the barn while Ivy checked the garden. Dr. Pierce and Judge Blackwood searched the outbuildings. Miriam stayed at the house, looking pleased with how things were unfolding. Ivy found him in the garden, in the plot they'd worked together to resurrect. He was sitting in the dirt between the rows of vegetables, surrounded by the drawings he'd torn from his walls. He'd brought them all outside. Hundreds of them. And he was sorting through them frantically, like he was looking for something specific. "Silas?" Ivy approached slowly. "Sweetheart, everyone's looking for you." He didn't acknowledge her, just kept sorting drawings, his movements jerky and desperate. "What are you looking for? Can I help?" Finally, Silas found what he wanted. He grabbed one particular drawing and held it up. It was one of the oldest drawings, one from just after his mother's death. It showed a woman lying still in a bed, a small boy standing in the doorway, and a man with his face in his hands. The drawing Ivy had seen in the attic that first day. But this time, she noticed something she'd missed before. In the margins, in cramped, desperate handwriting, was a message. Not just words, a whole paragraph, written so small it was barely legible. Ivy knelt in the dirt beside him and read it. "I tried to tell Papa that Mama was getting worse. I tried to show him, but I couldn't make the words work anymore. They were stuck inside and wouldn't come out. I drew pictures instead. I drew Mama sick. I drew her dying. But nobody looked at my pictures, nobody understood. And then she was gone, and it was my fault because I couldn't make them understand that she needed help faster. I killed Mama because I couldn't talk." Ivy's vision blurred. "Oh, Silas, no, that's not—" But he was already writing on a fresh piece of paper, his hand moving so fast the pencil tore through in places. "Now they're going to take me away because I still can't talk. And Papa will be alone. And you'll leave. And it's my fault again. Everything is always my fault." "That's not true," Ivy said fiercely. "None of this is your fault. Not your mother's death, not this investigation, none of it." "Then why do people keep leaving?" The question, written in shaky letters, cut through Ivy like a knife. She pulled Silas into her arms, holding him while he shook with silent sobs. Around them, his drawings fluttered in the breeze, a paper record of 3 years of pain and grief and desperate attempts to be understood. That's how Gideon found them. Ivy holding his son in the dirt, surrounded by evidence of suffering that nobody had known how to see. And behind Gideon came Judge Blackwood, Dr. Pierce, and Miriam Crowley, all staring at the scene with different expressions. "What is all this?" the judge asked quietly. "This," Gideon said, his voice rough with emotion, "is 3 years of my son trying to tell us he was hurting. 3 years of him communicating in the only way he could. And none of us, none of the doctors, none of the specialists, nobody, understood what he was doing." He knelt down beside Ivy and Silas, picking up one of the drawings. "Until her." He looked at Ivy. "Until she came here and actually paid attention, actually listened, actually saw my son instead of just seeing a problem to be fixed." Judge Blackwood moved closer, examining the drawings scattered across the garden. He picked up several, reading the hidden messages, his expression growing more troubled with each one. "Dr. Pierce," he said slowly, "have you ever seen anything like this?" The physician looked uncomfortable. "It's unusual, but it doesn't change the fact that the boy needs professional—" "He is getting professional help," Ivy interrupted. "It's just not the kind you recognize. Sometimes healing doesn't look like what you expect it to look like." "That's not for you to decide," Miriam snapped. "You're not his mother. You're not his family. You're just some woman who wandered in and—" "She's more family than you'll ever be," Gideon said coldly. "And if you've got a problem with that, you can get off my property." Miriam's face went red. "Judge Blackwood, surely you can see that this environment is unhealthy. The boy is clearly disturbed, and these people are enabling his dysfunction rather than treating it." But the judge wasn't looking at Miriam anymore. He was reading one of the drawings, the one Ivy had read earlier, about Silas blaming himself for his mother's death. "Mr. Vale," he said quietly, "has your son been carrying this guilt all this time?" Gideon looked at the drawing and his face crumbled. I didn't know he blamed himself. I thought—" His voice broke. "I thought he just missed her. I didn't know he thought it was his fault." Judge Blackwood was silent for a long moment. Then he turned to Dr. Pierce. "In your professional opinion, would institutionalizing this child help him process this kind of trauma?" Dr. Pierce hesitated. "Well, in a controlled environment with trained professionals, that's not what I asked. Would taking him away from his father and his home help him heal from the belief that he caused his mother's death?" Another hesitation. "It's difficult to say." "Then let me be clear. I've seen children in institutions. I've seen what happens to traumatized children when you lock them away and try to force them to conform, and it rarely ends well." The judge looked at Silas, still held in Ivy's arms. "This boy has found a way to communicate. An unusual way, perhaps, but a way nonetheless. And he has people who understand that language." "Judge Blackwood," Miriam protested, "you can't possibly be suggesting—" "I'm suggesting that sometimes the best treatment isn't the most conventional one. And I'm suggesting that tearing this child away from the only people who seem to understand him might do more harm than good." Hope flickered in Ivy's chest, small and fragile, but real. The judge turned to Gideon. "I want to be clear, Mr. Vale. Your son needs continued support. I'm not saying this situation is perfect, but I'm also not convinced that institutional care is the answer." "So you're dismissing the investigation?" Gideon asked carefully. "I'm saying I need to see more evidence before making a final determination. I'll return in 30 days. At that time, I expect to see documented progress. Not necessarily speech, but clear signs that the child is thriving under current care. Can you provide that?" "Yes," Gideon said immediately. "Yes, we can." Judge Blackwood nodded. "Then we're done here for now. Dr. Pierce, Mrs. Crowley, we're leaving." Miriam looked like she'd been slapped. "You can't be serious. You're just going to leave that child with these people?" "I'm going to give them a chance to prove they're doing right by him. If you have a problem with my judgment, you're welcome to file a formal complaint with the territorial office." "I will," Miriam spat. "You can count on that. Do what you need to do, Mrs. Crowley. But for now, this investigation is concluded." He replaced his hat and headed for his horse. Dr. Pierce followed, looking relieved to escape. Miriam lingered, her expression venomous. "This isn't over," she hissed at Ivy. "You might have fooled the judge, but I know what you are. And eventually, everyone else will too." She mounted her horse and rode off without another word. The silence that followed their departure was almost overwhelming. Gideon stood up slowly, helping Ivy to her feet. Silas stayed pressed against her side, trembling from the emotional toll of the confrontation. "That was close," Gideon said quietly. "Too close," Ivy agreed. They gathered up the scattered drawings and carried them, along with Silas, back to the house. Inside, they sat at the kitchen table, none of them quite believing what had just happened. "We have 30 days, Gideon said. 30 days to show progress." "What kind of progress?" Ivy asked. "The judge said he doesn't expect Silas to speak, but he expects something, some sign that we're helping him heal." They both looked at Silas, who was staring at his hands. "What do you think, sweetheart?" Ivy asked gently. "What would help you?" Silas was quiet for so long that Ivy thought he wouldn't answer. Then slowly, carefully, he reached for a piece of paper and started writing. What he wrote made both adults go very still. I want to try to talk again, not because they're making me, because I want to show them they're wrong about me, wrong about us. Underneath, in smaller letters, will you help me? Ivy's throat was too tight to speak. She just nodded. Gideon wiped his eyes roughly and said, We'll do whatever you need, son. Whatever you need. Silas wrote one more line. I'm not doing it for them. I'm doing it for us, so they can't take our family away. And there it was again, that word, family. Ivy looked at Gideon, saw her own emotions reflected in his face. They'd survived the first battle, but the war was far from over. They had 30 days to prove that love and patience and unconventional methods could heal wounds that traditional medicine had given up on. 30 days to prove that this broken, imperfect family deserved to stay together. 30 days to teach a silent boy that his voice, however it emerged, mattered. As the sun set that evening, the three of them stood at the window together, watching the light turn the valley gold. Silas stood between Ivy and Gideon, holding both their hands. He didn't speak, not yet, but he was trying, and for now, that was enough. The 30 days that followed were the hardest and most remarkable of Ivy's life. Silas didn't wake up the next morning suddenly able to speak. There was no miracle, no dramatic breakthrough where words came flooding back after 3 years of silence. Real healing, Ivy learned, didn't work like that. It was messy and slow and full of setbacks that made you question whether anything was changing at all. But they tried anyway. Gideon cleared out a corner of the living room and set up what he called their practice space, a quiet area with comfortable chairs and good light where Silas could work without pressure. Ivy filled it with paper and pencils, books with pictures, anything that might help bridge the gap between what Silas wanted to say and what he could actually produce. The first week was frustrating. Silas would open his mouth, clearly trying to form words, and nothing would come out. Or sometimes sounds would emerge, small noises that weren't quite words but weren't quite silence either. Each failed attempt left him more discouraged, more convinced he'd never be able to do this. It's okay, Ivy would say each time. You don't have to force it. We have time. But they didn't really. They had 3 weeks left, then 2, then 1, and Miriam Crowley wasn't making things easier. She'd launched a campaign of whispers throughout Blackthorn Ridge, spreading rumors that escalated from merely cruel to outright vicious. Ivy heard them secondhand from Amos, who made supply runs to town and came back with increasingly disturbing reports. They're saying you've got some kind of hold over the boss, Amos told her one afternoon, looking uncomfortable. Like you bewitched him or something. Mrs. Crowley's telling everyone you're after his money. Ivy laughed bitterly at that. What money? The ranch is barely staying afloat. Don't matter if it's true. People like a good story more than they like facts. He was right. The rumors grew uglier. Some claimed Ivy was mistreating Silas behind closed doors. Others suggested she was involved in something improper with Gideon. A few even implied she'd driven Sarah Vale to her death through some kind of dark influence, never mind that Ivy hadn't arrived until years afterward. Ignore it, Gideon advised when Ivy came to him, shaking with anger and hurt. That's what Miriam wants, to get under your skin, make you doubt yourself. She's succeeding. Only if you let her. He caught her hand, a gesture that had become more common between them lately. You know the truth, I know the truth, Silas knows it, that's what matters. But Ivy wasn't sure that was enough. Truth had a way of losing to power, and Miriam Crowley had plenty of that. Still, they kept working. Day 12 brought their first real breakthrough. Ivy was reading aloud to Silas from one of his favorite books, a collection of frontier tales about cowboys and wild horses. Silas was following along, sometimes pointing to words he recognized, when she came to a passage about a boy trying to gentle a frightened colt. The boy spoke softly, Ivy read, knowing that harsh words would only scare the horse further. Easy, he murmured. Easy now. Beside her, Silas's lips moved, forming the shape of a word. Ivy stopped reading. Were you trying to say something? Silas looked startled, like he hadn't realized he'd done it. He tried again, his mouth forming the same shape. The sound was barely a whisper, rough and uncertain. Easy. The word hung in the air between them, fragile as spun glass. Ivy's hand started shaking. Silas? Sweetheart? Can you say it again? He tried, failed, tried again. Easy, he whispered. One word. After 3 years of silence, one single word. Ivy pulled him into a hug, laughing and crying at the same time. You did it. You said a word. A real word. Silas was trembling against her. When he pulled back, his face showed a mixture of shock and fear, and something that might have been hope. Gideon came running at the sound of Ivy's commotion. What happened? What's wrong? Nothing's wrong, Ivy said, wiping her face. Silas spoke. He said easy. Gideon froze. He what? Show him, Ivy encouraged Silas. Show your papa. But Silas couldn't do it again. The word had slipped out once, but now the silence was back, stubborn and impenetrable. He grabbed paper instead and wrote, I'm sorry, it won't come again. Hey, no, Gideon knelt in front of his son. You have nothing to apologize for. You spoke. That's huge. That's... His voice caught. I'm so proud of you. Silas buried his face in his father's shoulder, and Gideon held him while Ivy watched, feeling like she was witnessing something sacred. One word. It wasn't much, but it was everything. After that, the words came slowly. 1 or 2 a day, usually when Silas was relaxed and not thinking too hard about speaking. Short words at first, yes, no, please. Then slightly longer ones, hungry, tired, outside. They were always whispered, barely audible, like Silas was afraid that speaking too loudly would make the words disappear again. But they were real, undeniable. Gideon documented everything, writing down each word and the context in which it appeared. By day 20, they had a list of nearly 30 words Silas had spoken at least once. Is it enough? Ivy asked, staring at the list. Will the judge think this is sufficient progress? It has to be, Gideon said, but he sounded uncertain. The night before the judge's return visit, none of them slept well. Ivy lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, running through every possible outcome. Best case, the judge saw the progress and closed the investigation permanently. Worst case, he decided 30 words in 30 days wasn't enough, that Silas still needed institutional care, that Ivy's methods were too unconventional to be trusted. She must have eventually dozed off, because she woke to someone shaking her shoulder. Gideon stood beside her bed, his face pale in the pre-dawn darkness. It's Silas, he said. He's gone. Ivy was on her feet instantly. Gone? What do you mean, gone? He's not in his room, not anywhere in the house. I've checked everywhere. They searched frantically, the barn, the garden, the outbuildings. No sign of him. Ivy's heart was hammering so hard she could barely breathe. Where would he go? Why would he leave? Then she remembers something. The oak tree. The one by the front gate where she'd sat the morning she'd tried to leave. I know where he is, she said. They found him there, sitting beneath the oak tree with his knees pulled to his chest, watching the sunrise. He looked small and scared and very young. Silas, Gideon said, relief flooding his voice. You scared us half to death. What are you doing out here? Silas didn't answer, just held up a piece of paper he'd been clutching. Ivy took it and read by the growing light. What if I can't do it? What if I freeze up when the judge comes and I can't say anything and he takes me away? What if trying isn't good enough? Ivy's throat tightened. She sat down in the dirt beside him, not caring about her nightgown or the cold or anything except being present for this terrified child. You listen to me, she said quietly. That judge is coming here to see if you're thriving. Not if you're perfect, not if you're fixed, just if you're better than you were before. But I'm still broken, Silas whispered. Actually spoke, the words barely audible but real. You're not broken, Ivy insisted. You're healing. There's a difference. Broken things stay broken. Healing things get better, even if they get better slow, even if they don't look the same as they did before. Gideon had sat down on Silas's other side. Your mama used to say that the best flowers were the ones that had to grow in hard soil, said it made them stronger, more beautiful because they'd fought for it. Silas looked at his father, tears streaming down his face. I miss her, he whispered. I know, me too. Gideon pulled his son close. But she'd be so proud of you right now, so proud of how hard you're fighting. They sat there together as the sun came up. Three people who'd found each other in grief and loss and were somehow building something that looked like family. When they finally went back inside, Silas seemed calmer, more settled. But Ivy's nerves were still raw when, mid-morning, they heard horses approaching. Judge Blackwood had returned. And this time he'd brought company. Not just Dr. Pierce and Miriam Crowley, but several other officials Ivy didn't recognize. Witnesses, probably. People who'd verify whatever decision the judge made. They gathered in the living room, the space suddenly feeling too small for all these bodies and all this tension. "Mr. Vale," Judge Blackwood began, 30 days ago, I asked you to demonstrate that your son was thriving under current care. What do you have to show me?" Gideon presented everything, the documented list of words, the drawings showing emotional progress, written testimony from Amos and the other ranch hands about changes they'd observed in Silas. Dr. Pierce examined it all with pursed lips. 30 words in 30 days. That's hardly remarkable progress for a child who's been silent for 3 years. "It's more than he spoke in the previous 3 years combined," Ivy shot back, "under questionable methods from unqualified individuals. For all we know, you've been coaching him, forcing him to perform for this evaluation." "We haven't forced him to do anything," Gideon said through gritted teeth. Miriam, seated elegantly in one of their worn chairs, smiled like a cat with a cornered mouse. "I think what Dr. Pierce is suggesting is that this so-called progress might not be genuine. Children can be coached to say certain words without truly recovering their ability to speak naturally." "That's ridiculous," Ivy protested. "Is it? Then let's see the boy demonstrate his abilities without prompting, without his father or his hired keeper whispering in his ear." Judge Blackwood looked thoughtful. "That's not an unreasonable request. Mr. Vale, would you bring your son in?" Gideon hesitated, then went to get Silas from the kitchen where he'd been waiting. The boy came into the room and immediately went still, seeing all the adults staring at him. His eyes found Ivy's, desperate and frightened. "Hello, Silas," Judge Blackwood said gently. "Do you remember me?" Silas nodded. "I'm told you've been speaking some. Is that true?" Another nod. "Could you speak for me now, just a few words?" Silas's mouth opened, closed, his hands clenched at his sides. Nothing came out. "Take your time," the judge encouraged, but the pressure was too much. Ivy could see it in Silas's face, the panic building, the old fear creeping back in. He tried again, his whole body tense with effort. Still nothing. Dr. Pierce made a dismissive sound. "As I suspected. The boy can't actually speak. Whatever words he supposedly produced were likely the result of manipulation, or—" "Shut up," Silas whispered. The room went absolutely silent. "What did you say?" Dr. Pierce demanded. Silas looked directly at the physician, and when he spoke again, his voice was stronger. "I said, shut up. You don't know anything about me, about what I can or can't do." The words came out halting, each one clearly requiring effort, but they were there, real, undeniable. "You think I'm broken," Silas continued, his voice shaking but determined. "Everyone does. The doctors and the town and you." He pointed at Miriam. "But I'm not. I'm just different, and different isn't wrong." Ivy felt tears streaming down her face, but she didn't move, didn't interrupt. This was Silas's moment. "For 3 years, people told me I needed to be fixed, that I needed to talk like before, or I wasn't worth keeping." Silas's voice cracked. "But Ivy, Miss Mercer, she never said that. She just let me be me. And Papa stopped trying to make me into something I couldn't be, and that made it safe to try." He turned to look at Judge Blackwood. "I'm not healed yet. Maybe I'll never be exactly like I was before Mama died, but I'm getting better. And if you take me away from here, from them, I'll stop getting better. I'll go back to being that scared kid who thought everyone was waiting for him to fail." The silence that followed was profound. Judge Blackwood leaned forward in his chair. "Silas, I want you to understand something. Nobody here wants you to fail. We're all just trying to figure out what's best for you." "Then let me stay home," Silas said. "Let me stay with my family." There was that word again, family. Judge Blackwood looked at the other officials, at Dr. Pierce, at Miriam Crowley. Then he looked back at Silas. "Son, what you just did took more courage than most adults could muster. Speaking in front of a room full of strangers when you've been silent for years? That's remarkable." He stood up, brushing dust from his jacket. "I've seen enough. This investigation is concluded. What? Miriam stood too, her face flushed. You can't possibly. I can, and I am. This child is clearly thriving in his current environment. He's making progress, developing healthy coping mechanisms, and maintaining strong family bonds. There is no justification for removal from his home. But he's still damaged, Dr. Pierce protested. He'll never be a normal child. Define normal, the judge said sharply. This boy has experienced trauma that would break most adults. The fact that he's functioning at all is a testament to his strength and to the people who've supported him. I won't punish him for healing differently than you expect. He turned to Gideon and Ivy. Mr. Vale, Miss Mercer, I'm closing this case permanently. There will be no further investigations, no mandatory evaluations, nothing. Your family is free to continue as you see fit. The relief was so intense Ivy nearly collapsed. Gideon caught her elbow, his own face showing the same overwhelming emotion. However, Judge Blackwood continued, I strongly recommend you consider formalizing Miss Mercer's position in this household. Her presence has clearly been beneficial, but without legal standing, she could be vulnerable to future challenges. It took Ivy a moment to understand what he was suggesting. You mean, Gideon started, I mean that if Miss Mercer were your wife rather than your employee, no one could question her right to help raise your son. Just a thought. The judge picked up his hat. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have other matters to attend to. He left, taking the other officials with him. Dr. Pierce followed, looking sour. Miriam was the last to leave, pausing in the doorway to deliver one final barb. You may have won today, she said quietly, but everyone in the territory will know what you are. A desperate widow and the fat woman he hired out of loneliness. You'll never be accepted here, never be anything but a scandal. Good thing I've never cared much about acceptance, Ivy replied. Miriam's jaw tightened. Then she swept out, defeated but not entirely vanquished. When they were finally alone, the three of them stood in the living room, trying to process what had just happened. We won, Gideon said, like he couldn't quite believe it. They can't take you. We won, Silas repeated, his voice still quiet but growing stronger. Then he did something he'd never done before. He walked over to Ivy and Gideon and wrapped his arms around both of them, pulling them into a hug. Thank you, he whispered. Thank you for fighting for me. Ivy couldn't speak, could only hold this brave, remarkable child and his father and think about how close they'd come to losing everything. That evening, after Silas had gone to bed, Ivy and Gideon found themselves on the porch, watching another sunset paint the valley in impossible colors. The judge was right, you know, Gideon said quietly. About what? About formalizing your position here. He turned to look at her. About you being vulnerable. Gideon, you don't have to. I'm not saying this because the judge suggested it. I'm saying it because it's true, and because he stopped, took a breath. Because somewhere along the way, you stopped being hired help and started being something else, something more. Ivy's heart was doing complicated things in her chest. What are you saying? I'm saying I don't want you here just because Silas needs you. I want you here because I need you too. Because this place feels like a home when you're in it. Because I've been half alive for 3 years, and you made me remember what it feels like to be whole. He reached for her hand, his calloused fingers rough against hers. I know I'm not much of a catch, struggling rancher with a traumatized son and more debts than assets. But if you'd consider it, if you'd even think about staying permanently, I'd spend the rest of my life trying to make you happy. Ivy looked at him through tears. Are you asking me to marry you? I guess I am, if you'll have me. She should have said yes immediately, should have thrown her arms around him and accepted without hesitation. But old fears were hard to shake. Gideon, people like Miriam are right about one thing. I'm not what people expect. I'm not beautiful or refined or... You're brave, Gideon interrupted. You're kind. You're the strongest person I know, and you're exactly what we need. What I need. He cupped her face with his free hand. I don't care what Miriam Crowley or anyone else thinks. I care what you think, what you want. So what do you want, Ivy? What did she want? She wanted this. Wanted mornings in this kitchen and evenings at this window. Wanted to watch Silas grow and heal and become whoever he was meant to be. Wanted to build a life with people who saw her as she actually was and loved her anyway. Yes, she said. Yes, I'll marry you. Gideon kissed her then, gentle and careful, like she was something precious he was afraid of breaking. And Ivy kissed him back, pouring 3 months of fear and hope and love into that moment. When they finally broke apart, they found Silas watching from his bedroom window, a huge smile on his face. He gave them a thumbs up, and they both laughed. They were married 3 weeks later in a small ceremony at the ranch, not in Blackthorn Ridge where Miriam's influence still poisoned the air, just here, at home, with Amos and the other ranch hands as witnesses, and Silas standing between them holding their hands. The circuit preacher asked if anyone objected, and Silas very clearly said no, making everyone laugh. When it was over, when Ivy was officially Mrs. Gideon Vale, she stood with her new family and looked at the life they'd built together. It wasn't perfect. The ranch still struggled financially. The town still whispered. Silas still had hard days when words wouldn't come. But they had each other, and that turned out to be enough. In the months that followed, Silas's speech continued to improve. He'd never be as talkative as other children his age, and he still preferred drawing to speaking when emotions ran high. But he could communicate, could express himself, could tell his father he loved him and mean it. The first time he called Ivy Mama, she cried for an hour. Miriam Crowley eventually left Blackthorn Ridge, following her husband to a political appointment in a larger city. Before she left, she made one final attempt to cause trouble, but by then the story of how Silas had spoken up to save his family had spread throughout the territory. Public opinion, fickle as it was, had shifted in the Vale's favor. Turns out people loved an underdog story more than they loved gossip. The ranch slowly stabilized. Gideon's hard work combined with Ivy's careful management of resources pulled them back from the edge of financial ruin. They'd never be wealthy, but they were secure, safe. And one autumn evening, 5 years after Ivy had first arrived at the ranch, the family gathered at the window to watch the sunset. Silas was 12 now, taller and more confident, with a sketchbook always tucked under his arm. He still drew constantly, but now he also spoke. Not a lot, but enough. "Best sunset of the season," he said quietly. "You say that every time," Gideon teased, "because it's always true." Ivy smiled, one hand resting on her slightly rounded belly where a new life was growing. A sibling for Silas, a child who would grow up knowing only love and acceptance and the understanding that different wasn't broken. She thought about the woman she'd been 5 years ago, alone, mocked, convinced she'd never matter to anyone. And she thought about the woman she'd become, a wife, a mother, someone who'd fought for her family and won. Healing had never been about fixing what was broken. It had been about learning that broken pieces could still create something beautiful if you arranged them with care. Silas leaned against her side, and Gideon wrapped an arm around them both, and they stood there watching the light fade from the valley. A silent boy who'd found his voice on his own terms. A grieving father who'd learned that love meant accepting people as they were, not forcing them to be what he needed. And a woman who'd discovered that belonging wasn't about being perfect. It was about finding people who valued you anyway. 3 broken people who'd somehow built a whole family. And as the last light left the sky and stars began to emerge, Ivy realized something that made her smile. She'd been wrong all those years ago. She wasn't nobody. She was exactly who she needed to be. And she was finally, irrevocably, home.